Experience 10 days of Grand Europe trip for easy EMI of Rs 25,000 only with GT Holidays, South India's #1 travel brand.
Wonder Diamond, South India's largest lab-grown diamond brand, stores at Chennai, Coimbatore, Bangalore and Hyderabad.
Smriti Mundhra, welcome to Galattaplus. Great to have you here. And your show, The Romantics, is, turning out to be quite the hit on Netflix. I think it's making a lot of people very nostalgic about a certain kind of cinema. But before that, we get into the documentary. I want to talk about your father, Jagmohan Mundhra, and there's a connection that you had with Yash Chopra and Yash Raj Films even before you started making this documentary, because in 1976, when Kabhi Kabhi was released, your father released it in LA, the film in LA, and it was possibly the first Hindi language film to be released in that part of America.
My parents had a theater called the Moralta Theater in Los Angeles. That was the first, they were the first exhibitors of Hindi films in the United States. So I don't think Kabhi Kabhi, I'm not sure, honestly, when exactly. I'm not sure if that was the first one that was released in that theater, but it was a very special time. It was before I was born. So it only, lives in my mind, through the memories of people who were there. But it was apparently a very special time, in Los Angeles, and the theater was sort of a hub for the Desi community, the very nascent Desi community that was forming here, and Kabhi Kabhi was a part of that story.
Why do you think that nascent Desi community connected so much to Yash Chopra's aesthetic in a way they didn't to, let's say, like Raj Kapoor or Manoj Kumar? Of course, they were doing well, but when you think of NRI, the community in UK and the US especially, it's the Yash Chopra aesthetic that pretty much dominates the diaspora, that particular part of diaspora. So Raj Kapoor may have his Russia and all that, but out here it was this aesthetic. So what do you think brought about that connect?
I'm sure there's a multitude of factors, and maybe some of them are sort of pragmatic things like accessibility, which films are accessible here, generationally, speaking, once that aesthetic, that Yash Chopra style and aesthetic had really taken grasp in Hindi cinema, by the time those films came to the United States, it was the 90s, and it was a little more accessible, in the late 80s and 90s. So maybe that had some role to play with it, but romantically speaking, I think, what I would, what I always believed and what I always felt is that, Yash Chopra's films kind of gave us a way of feeling both connected to India, as NRIs, in a very fundamental way, which was so important, prior, in a time before social media, before, the accessibility of air travel, that was like the movies were our connection to home. But also, I think Yash Chopra's films also gave us a sense that we're at home anywhere in the world. Seeing a woman in a sari in Switzerland, kind of made us feel that we can be ourselves anywhere in the world. And I think maybe there was an element of that. I know I certainly felt that when I saw DDLJ for the first time. I saw my culture, my traditions in a more traditionally Western setting, that felt accessible. So maybe that's also a part of it. I would like to think, if I can philosophize about that.
I want you to philosophize about that because, and I'm looking at it from the inside, you're looking at it from a different point of view. So it's really interesting to hear how, you process these films, because that's part of, what makes, because, you have these, because these films are not just hits within India, they're also big hits and cultural phenomena outside the country as well, within the diaspora, and now, outside of the diaspora as well, slowly. So that's why you're philosophizing, if you want to call it that. It's really interesting. So do you have any other thing to share about that particular aspect of why, is it also possibly the beauty of what you were showing, which is like, as opposed to, this is a wild swing because it's the other end of the spectrum. Like let's say, at one point, Satyajit Ray got criticized a lot for, showing India's poverty and kind of, exporting it to the West. I forget the exact quote, but he was once accused. I think Nargis, the actor, Nargis, accused him of that. Do you think that was like, I don't want to see that, but this is giving me a positive representation of India? Could that also be a factor within that?
I would frame it a little differently. I wouldn't frame it as in opposition to Ray. I think
that's why I said it's very like it. I mean, I didn't.
Yeah, exactly. No, I know exactly. I get exactly what you mean, but I think it's it's more of that's part of nostalgia, right? It's sort of remembering things in their best light, remembering things in the most sort of poetic, romantic way, so to speak. And I think Yash Chopra definitely did that, for India, for us, like it was the most robust, the most romantic representation of Indian families, of Indian culture, traditions, festivals, Holi, all of that. And I think that was part of it. But I think another thing that might also have really played a big factor is just the music, and I think that Yash Chopra, really identified that as a key component, to great movies, was great music, and music that would really stay with you. I mean, he says it, in the docu-series, where he says that, he believes that, a song at a time where action films were really dominating in the box office in India, and people were telling him that Chandani had too many songs, and he said, no, I don't. I believe that songs are as much of a highlight because they stay with you, long after you leave the theater. And I think that's especially true for NRIs, where the songs, this is the music we played at every birthday party, at every wedding, at every family function, when it was just us, separate from, when we could be just us and we didn't have to assimilate, into the world that we had adopted. So I think the music also probably had a role to play in that.
Speaking of the music, there's one thing that I would have liked to know, but it's not there in the documentary. And I was wondering if there's some computer in your part of the world that has this deleted footage, because I'm sure you shot a lot and had to kind of really take out a lot. Yash Chopra is given the titan that he was, and given the access that he had within the industry, he strangely worked only with two very popular composers, that's Lakshmikant Pyarelal and R.D. Burman. The rest of the time he worked with relatively, when I say lesser, I don't mean talent wise, but in terms of popularity, Khayyam, Shiv Hari, Uttam Singh. Is there some part of the documentary where you kind of found out this, but then decided that it was not kind of fitting into the narrative, but you just had it out? I'm just curious.
When you're trying to condense 70 years of history and hundreds of hours of material into 4 1-hour episodes, a lot gets left out, that you wish could be in. And I think as far as music goes, we made the choice. I made the choice that the narrative about the music would be through Pam Chopra and her contribution to that. And then, just for reasons of real estate, in the time that we had, we just had to move on from that, in the series. But certainly, I mean, that's not to minimize the contribution of all of the artists and the poets, actually, that contributed to the music that was in Yash Chopra's films, could do a whole other, a whole other 4-parter or 5-parter, just on that. But yeah, it was really mostly just because there was a lot to condense, into a short amount of time.
And speaking of, condensing a lot into, I can also understand why you speak of certain films and not about other films, because there's such a huge number of films to talk about. But there's one particular thing that I wanted to know. Because there's this trilogy of Yash Chopra / Salim Javed films, which is like begins with Diwar, goes on with Trishul, and ends with Kala Pathar. And there is no mention of Trishul, and Kala Pathar is basically, I think there's one small scene with Shatrughan Sinha and Amitabh coming towards each other, but like I think that's pretty much it. And another movie that I missed hearing something about was like that came much later was Dil To Pagal Hai, which was a very defining hit of its generation. It was like you can hardly imagine that a man of that age was kind of making a movie that was speaking to the youth in such a manner. Again, did you get material and did it break your heart to leave it out?
Absolutely. It's really, a lot of these decisions were largely just about trying to condense everything into 4 episodes and give the audience a taste, give an audience an overview essentially, of this journey and encourage them to go back and revisit these films, their favorite films, and maybe films that they had forgotten about or had never discovered before for themselves. But certainly, I think the thought process behind which films were chosen, was that the films, were meant to speak to not only the zeitgeist of the time and have a significant role in the journeys and the stories of Yash Chopra and later Aditya Chopra and sort of their career trajectory, and also, be saying something about the story of the studio, right? So sometimes, that meant focusing on films that are maybe lesser known, or less obvious, and leaving behind some films that are beloved, rightfully so, because it's, again, like a documentary, it's sort of a forward moving train, and so sometimes you just have to make choices like that. So there was definitely that, and no reflection at all on the merit, or the importance of the films.
Yeah, I mean, there is no reflection on the merit of those films. I was just curious about, how these hard decisions came about, because there's like, especially when you start talking about, DDLJ, at some point you might have considered something like, do I concentrate so much on DDLJ, or do I cut back a bit and, put in another movie? And then these are all tough choices that every filmmaker makes. So I was kind of wondering about that. So yeah,
they're always they're tough choices always. And there was a lot of, this is why it took over 2 years to edit the series, because it was a lot of, put this in and then, but it's just out of place at this point in the narrative, or this film is like lesser known, but it's an important milestone, in the personal story, of these filmmakers and had a impact that maybe people don't know about, so there was a lot of decisions like that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
You talked about real estate. Why did the decision to restrict it to 4 episodes come about? Roughly that they're about 50 to an hour each. Why did that decision? Why not, let's say, 6 or 8? I mean, because there is so much out there. How did that decision come about?
As a filmmaker, I would have loved to make this even a 10-parter and gone into so many different, lanes and avenues. But the real honest answer is, one, because, I am learning as a filmmaker that it's always good to leave an audience wanting a little bit more, and also, as opposed to overstaying your welcome. And also because, I wanted this series to be really accessible to a wide audience,
Right.
The widest possible audience. And I think for a mainstream Indian audience, I mean, India has had a robust history of documentary filmmaking for decades now, so documentary is not new in India, but documentary to a wider, audience, a mainstream audience, is relatively new, it's relatively new. And I wanted mainstream audiences to watch this series and be able to stay with it and be engaged with it throughout, and not drop off after an episode or two. And I felt like 4 was the right number, to really get people hooked and keep the pace going, and hopefully get people excited enough that they would go back and binge all the Yash Chopra's old films and debate on social media about what their favorite films were, and I'll start that conversation.
What is your favorite film of Yash Chopra's and Yash Chopra's, not Yash Raj necessarily, Yash Chopra's, and why?
For absolutely no reason whatsoever. I have no need now to rewatch these films that I have now watched multiple times each, over the course of making this series. But just in this past week, I've just been rewatching all the films, because I'm reading all the comments, and it's interesting to hear people's perspectives and their memories of the films that they love. So I've been thinking, I'm like, maybe will my opinion change, from a year ago, 2 years ago, or, from my childhood, but it really hasn't. And my favorite Yash Chopra film, the film that just is like sparks magic in me, every time I watch it, is Chandani.
Okay.
That film just has it all. So, and I rewatched it again this week.
You're not new to documentaries. You've made or rather co-directed St. Louis Superman, which was nominated for an Oscar. So belated congratulations. That's really, really a super achievement. What is the difference between making something like that and making something like this? I mean it in 2 ways. One is in terms of pure subject matter, and in terms of making a documentary about the very people that are producing the documentary. So in both ways, what is the difference between making something like St. Louis Superman versus The Romantics?
One is definitely format. St. Louis Superman was a short film. It was 30 minutes long. Romantics is a series, so it's 4 hours. It's also the audience. I think all of my films or all of my projects that I do is some kind of exploration of something, about the world that I live in. So a lot of it has to do with sort of the big themes and the big tropes, that are that consume the minds of Indian people, whether it's marriage, through Indian matchmaking, or a suitable girl, or in this case, cinema. And in some cases it's about the world that I spend most of my time in, which is America. And St. Louis Superman was an exploration of race and trauma in America, specifically through that lens, made at a time when those conversations were really bubbling up, in a new and different way. So I think the films were, or the projects were made for very different audiences and for different intentions. But also for me, I like to experiment in different forms. St. Louis Superman being a verite documentary, and The Romantics being sort of an archival, series with interviews. It just keeps things interesting for me as a filmmaker. But all of these things exist in me. All of these questions exist in me as a person in this world, and that's really my first touchstone. Is what is, what unanswered questions do I have, in this world? What do I want to explore? And that's sort of how I choose my projects. And then I try to keep it interesting, try to keep it a balance of, I have my my shorter documentaries, which are a little bit more of my indulgences, in terms of the form and the style, and I can explore, heavier subject matter. And then, in the series that are meant to be consumed by a wider audience, I tried to find those themes in the most accessible packaging, so that's sort of, explains the pulls of my work a little bit.
The difference between, doing your own thing versus making a documentary about the people that are like producing the thing. I mean, how does that because there are questions of neutrality, that there are questions of wanting to, who controls the narrative. So when you come to that, how do you keep your distance from the fact that you are speaking to the very people that are making this in a way?
That's always a question, for documentary filmmakers. And I think, first and foremost, I know this is a little bit, sort of uninteresting behind the scenes stuff, but documentary credits, are very different, than fiction credits. And oftentimes, they're people are included in producing credits that because they provided a lot of material and, things like that. And the case with, with The Romantics is that in order to make the series, I needed access to all the films. I needed access to all the music and the behind the scenes, and things like that. And obviously the place to get that was Yash Raj Films. And, when I initially approached them with this idea, they were very, on board with it and excited about it. And they facilitated a lot of those materials for me. But there was no, there was no fingers in the creative, they were very hands off about that, and very deliberately so, because I think for all of us, the whole point of this was not to make something that felt, like it was being controlled, by the studio, or being controlled by anyone but me. And, I'm appreciative. And I think, I'm appreciative for that, because that's not always the case. But yeah, I think in this case, it was just a practical thing. It wasn't like, I was being dictated to who to talk to, or what to do, or what films to include, or what not to include. And, any of that. It was really just more of the studio facilitating what I needed in order to tell the story when I asked for it.
One of the questions that everybody's going to have is, how did you get Aditya Chopra to speak? So that's like, people have asked you before. Now I'm asking you after. So how did it happen?
It was probably the biggest challenge, of this whole process. And like I said, as accommodating, as Yash Raj Films was with every other aspect of what I needed in terms of, giving me all of this amazing behind the scenes, never before seen footage and access, and clearance to use all of the films and all of the music and everything. The one line that was drawn very early was that, don't expect, Aditya Chopra to be involved, and eventually, what I had pitched them on, in starting this whole process was that I wanted to make something that really felt like a tribute to Hindi cinema history, and sort of the best of times, as it were, like, just reminding people of what we love about movies, and to tell that story through the lens of, for me, who was, one of the most influential filmmakers, Yash Chopra, and for this to be a tribute to his work as a major auteur, in global cinema, who I don't think gets as much due as he's, deserves. I went to film school, I studied, Kurosawa, I studied Godard, I studied, all of, amazing filmmakers from all over the world. But, in film schools, you don't study the greats of Hindi cinema, there's just this perception that it's sort of singing, dancing, weddings color, but I think, when I sort of made that intention clear, eventually, I was able to convince Aditya through many, many intermediate steps, was able to convince him that you cannot actually tell the definitive story of Yash Chopra without the perspective of Aditya Chopra, because obviously there's father and son relationship there, but they were also colleagues, they were creative collaborators, and so much of that insight, especially because we know Yash Chopra is no longer with us, and I only had his archive, to speak for him. So much of that story is held, with Aditya Chopra. And eventually, after much convincing, he relented. He agreed to that. And I think it was, really, it took a little bit of tugging on his, his feelings of respect for his father to convince him to do it.
I think that was very crucial to the documentary, because there's a huge passing of the baton feel to the whole narrative, and I don't know, but it might have felt incomplete without Aditya Chopra's very eloquent speech, because I don't think anybody's heard him speak much, so it was what's it going to be like, and that was the big surprise. The other Chopra here is Uday Chopra, and among other things, you use him as a pivot to bring about the topic of nepotism. How did that come about in a film of this nature? Because I'm just curious, because Yash Chopra, or Yash Raj films, they've introduced as many people from outside the industry. Just take Band Baja Barat. You have Ranveer, and you have Anushka. There's been so many, down the years. Poonam Dhillon was not part of the, when she did Noori, she was not part of the industry or whatever it is. So what was the motivation behind bringing about the nepotism debate in this context?
It would be disingenuous to tell the story without touching on that in some way, and while this series is not an expose, it's not a, it's meant to be a sort of a nostalgic look, at the culture and impact of Hindi cinema. It would be disingenuous to explore, all of this without touching on that topic. And thankfully, both Uday and Aditya were very game to go there, and very vulnerable and open and speaking about it. And I think, honestly, this is something that it shouldn't be as taboo as it is. It shouldn't be as divisive as it is. It's a fact that exists. Nepotism is a fact that exists in this world, in every industry, in every corner of the globe, from, since the beginning of time. It's just much more visible, I think, when you talk about entertainment industries, whether it's the Hindi film industry or even in Hollywood, it's a big conversation in Hollywood. It's much more visible, and it's also, I think it just activates more conversation, because the film industry, entertainment industry feels so much more closed off than any other industry. It feels so much more impenetrable, to outsiders. So it's a perfectly valid topic of conversation, but I think what Aditya reminded us of is that, yes, it exists. Yes, it means that certain people get more advantages, than others. But at the end of the day, it's the audience that decides, who becomes a star. And I think it sort of ties into the theme throughout the film, that it's really, at the end of the day, all of this is about the audience. It's about pleasing an audience and capturing the imagination of an audience. And, from Aditya's earliest, days, of his youth, like that was something he knew very early on. So I felt like it was part of that whole conversation in terms of who gets to decide what works, who gets to decide what's that tension between, the sort of vision of an artist and the way art is received in the world. This whole idea of nepotism and who gets to be on screen is very much a vital part of that conversation. And I couldn't leave it completely unaddressed.
One of the things this documentary reminds us, not that one needs reminding, is that, as often as, producers like Yash Raj are accused of NRI-izing the Hindi film, model, they've also, with Bunty or Bubbly and Dam Laga Ke Haisha, all these movies, they've kind of brought back the small town into the small town India, rural India, into the big screen again. And but still, my favorite part of the documentary was when Shah Rukh, went into detail about why the stammer happened when he pronounced Kiran in Dar, and to have an actor explain a decision like that in such an incisive and psychologically interesting manner was fascinating. That was my favorite part of the documentary. What was yours?
Thank you for noticing that. Because I agree. I mean, I think it's so fascinating to hear about these choices, right? And the thought that goes behind them. And, like it just goes back to my hope for this series is that, that for an Indian audience or an audience that has loved these films, and has already so attuned, and is so a part of this history, that it would feel very nostalgic. But for a global audience, that it would make it clear that, this doesn't just happen. It's not just, some people singing and dancing, that there's actual thought, and a cinematic language, that is behind these films. So thank you for noticing that. For me, oh my gosh, it's so difficult to pick a favorite part without, and especially without sounding like this, like patting myself on the back about the series. But I think for me, one of the things that was the most revelatory while making it was seeing Aditya's notebooks from when he was a kid and his obsession with movies, his absolute obsession with movies, and understanding the reasoning behind why he keeps himself, so off the radar, because he never wanted to lose that connection. He never wanted to not be able to go sit in a movie theater, and watch a film with the audience that the film was intended for. As a filmmaker, for me, that was a revelation, and it really honestly helped me rethink sort of how I operate in this world as a filmmaker, and it was very inspiring. So I think if I had to pinpoint something, that might be one.
But tell me something, people do know what he looks like. So when he goes to a theater, does he take a couple of bodyguards with him or something? Like, because, we live in a world where nobody is invisible, So, surely, how does he watch movies? I mean, how does he do?
I don't know specifically. I imagine a baseball hat and some kind of a high collar is involved. And, when there's one or two photos, like of somebody accessible, that too from many years ago, I feel like it's kind of amazing actually how, if you choose to, how anonymous one can be, maybe some of us are so used, at least I'm so used to putting my whole life on Instagram and social media and everything that it feels impossible to have that level of anonymity, but it is possible. So
did it feel a little ironic that a documentary series called The Romantics about a production house that is known for its romantic films is coming out just when they've scored their biggest hit in the form of a huge big ass action movie, Pathan. This that kind of, oh my God.
And that too with Shah Rukh Khan.
Yeah, that too with Shah Rukh Khan. Yeah. So
absolutely. I mean, the irony is dripping on that one. Of course, I knew nothing of Pathan when we were making the series. That was tightly under wraps. Until I saw the film in the theater, I had no idea, quite that it was the action film that Shah Rukh was talking about wanting to do with Adi all those years. So yeah, but I think it just shows the versatility of the studio, and its ability to both be the thing that people expect and also just go completely in the other direction, when least expected. So, but yeah, very ironic.
And finally, just like there are two generations of filmmakers, here in this documentary. There's two generations of filmmakers in your story as well, your personal story, your father and you. With your father, he made Surag and Kamla, which were, it had stars like Shabana Azmi, Deepti Nawal, Mark Zuber when Mark Zuber was a thing, and there were Sanjeev Kumar, so they were fairly mainstream in kind of a thing, and then he kind of disappeared. So just for the sake of adding to history that has not been told, can you kind of give a little thing about what happened to your father? What was his experience in the Hindi film system, and why he chose to go outside, and what was his experience like?
My father began his career soon after, in 1980, as a filmmaker. It was something he always wanted. He was a middle-class boy from Calcutta, had no connections in the film industry whatsoever. He was bright, so he got into IIT, and then got a scholarship to come and study in the US, and did his PhD here. Engineering track, classic track, but always, since he was a boy, really always wanted to be a filmmaker. Always, like, that was his first passion and his first love. So when he came here, he really hustled. He tried to figure out any which way, to become a filmmaker, and which was not easy in the 1970s for a boy from Calcutta with a PhD in engineering. And so he and my mother started the Moralta Theater, essentially as a way to stay connected to the movies, but also so my father could make contacts, with producers, exhibitors, et cetera, financiers, trying to plant the seeds to one day start making his own films. And he was able to do so, a few years, after the theater launched, and was successful by making those first couple of films, Surag and Kamla. And he didn't actually disappear. He actually, from that time, he made a film, at least one film every year after that.
Yeah.
In fact, when he died, he was in pre-production on his 40th film. But my father, he went wherever he could find opportunity, and wherever he could find a way to be standing behind a camera on a set. So after making those first couple of films in the Hindi film industry, there was sort of opportunity again in America with the VHS boom and the demand for more straight to VHS films. So he came here and he worked under Roger Corman's banner and some other banners, and got opportunity to make films here. And at that point, I was a kid. I was I was settled here, school, all of that. So he was looking for more opportunities here in the West, and his entire life was sort of back and forth, between making films in the West, in America, and then making films in India. Even in later years, he worked with Govinda and Naughty by 40, and then Naughty at 40. And he then worked in Europe, when there was financing opportunities available in Europe, and made a film with Aishwarya Rai called Provoked in London. So he really went wherever he could find himself on a set and behind a camera, because that was his true passion and his happy place. And in that way, he actually reminds me so much of Yash Chopra. I felt very connected to Yash Chopra, though I never met him personally. I felt very connected to him because that same sense of passion, I felt in him. And I think that's, why I was so also maybe partially also very partial to telling Yash Chopra's story, because I felt a lot of connection to my own dad.
Nice, because these are I would say, there was also Bhavandar, which he made. So that was also there. So, when I said disappear, I didn't mean like he went off, but he went a little off the radar. That's what I meant. It kind of, in terms of the mainstream, that's what. But, what has been the feedback to the Romantics from people in India versus, people, the diaspora? Has there been very similar kind of feedback, or has there been divergent feedback?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's been so amazing, and I don't know if I could have expected or predicted this, is just how much the series is reminding people. It's just connecting with people on a really visceral, a really, emotional level, like just remembering the films that they love, the films that they grew up with. And for us diaspora kids, people of the diaspora, it's been really interesting to revisit the films that really kept us connected to our Indian roots, back in the day. So it's been really overwhelming on both sides. I think nostalgia and goosebumps are like the two most like common words that I'm seeing used, of people who are watching the series. And I have to say, like, some of the most meaningful messages I've been getting have been from, a few people have messaged me to say that they've been watching the series with their loved ones, who are maybe a little elderly and who maybe are suffering from Alzheimer's, dementia, and it's just connecting, with them. Like, it's that nostalgia factor, the music, like kind of connecting with something that's so deeply ingrained in them has sort of brought something out, even of people who, are losing that part of themselves. I could have never in my life expected that. I mean, it's been so special and so meaningful to me. And of course, there's, like just the right healthy amount of critique that, keeps me humble and grounded as a filmmaker, so I don't get too full of myself. But overwhelmingly, the response, both abroad and in India has been just one of a lot of love for the series. And I'm so grateful for that.
Right. You mentioned goosebumps. So let me just end this by, my goosebump moment here is when, when Ranveer talks about, being, studying abroad in the US and, his class is filled with Korean and, people who are not really Indian and American students and all that. And suddenly there's this opportunity to perform a monologue, and he gives the one from dialogue, from Diwar, the Mere Paas Maa Hai, that the Amitabh bit leading up to it, and Shashi Kapoor's response to it, with that bullet point kind of response to it, and that kind of and the way he explained it was, it's not about Yashraj or anything like that. It's something larger about how cinema connects. It's like, if you are, convincing, language or culture is really no barrier to kind of, I guess I'm getting a little romantic here, but what I'm trying to say is that I think there's that little anecdote kind of encapsulates why films about filmmakers are so fascinating, because they most of us, we identify with films at an almost primal level, because right now they are the most consumed media, in whether it's films or series or documentaries or whatever it is, visual media. And that was, my goosebump moment out here. So thank you so much for the romantics and for the time.
Thank you. This was lovely. Thank you so much.
Experience 10 days of Grand Europe trip for easy EMI of Rs 25,000 only with GT Holidays, South India's #1 travel brand.
Wonder Diamonds, South India's largest lab-grown diamond brand, stores at Chennai, Coimbatore, Bangalore and Hyderabad.